I have the great honor of moderating the final session of the day, which is focused on how technology and innovations can help to change the pace and quality of care for expectant mothers and developing children. It's been a great day so far. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. A huge amount of scientific research and innovation happening, certainly across the board for those areas of expecting mothers and for developing children. And like I said, this session is really focused in on how we can harness technologies and innovations and inventions. And it will include illustrious speakers from Google's Verily, from our own Stanford Biodesign program, from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And the individuals you're about to hear from will help to showcase how these kinds of technological innovations can really impact change. The first speaker today will be Tom Insel from Verily, Google's Verily. He has led the research field from the National Institutes of Mental Health for well over a decade, leading change, driving change, and funding research projects in the area of mental health and child development. And we've had the great fortune recently of being able to, or at least Google has had the great fortune of recently recruiting him from his directorship at NIMH over to Google to help lead some of the programs at Verily, which was historically Google's life sciences division. And so without further ado, I'd like to bring Tom up to the stage. I'm very excited to have him. I'm looking forward to hear his perspective on technologies and their impact on mental illness.
Great. Thanks very much, Dennis. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I've just arrived, but I've understood that this has been a pretty exciting day already. I should say by way of introduction that I'm not an expert on mothers and children, except that I'm a father and grandfather, and everything I know about that topic I've learned through my own children and grandchildren. I'm not an expert on technology. I'm actually kind of a technophobe and a techno-cynic, but I'm learning, and I'm in some ways I think I'm helpful to Google and to Verily because I don't believe most of the hype that one reads about. And that's actually valuable because I think we're at a point where we have some really cool gizmos, but whether they actually have an impact on care is a question that still remains to be answered, at least for the most part. What I'd like to do is to talk about a different part of development, which is mostly to try to convey to you that one of our biggest public health problems are mental disorders, and that those can be thought of actually as developmental or neurodevelopmental disorders, something that hasn't come up much today. I'll start with this slide that gives you a sense of the public health burden. DALYS. DALYS are disability-adjusted life years. It's a composite measure of both morbidity and mortality. So it's putting together premature death along with years lost to disability to get this single metric. It's the kind of thing that only an economist would love, but it's helpful because it allows you to compare across different areas of medicine to get some sense of what are the big drivers for disability. And in this case, as you can see, neuropsychiatric disorders actually outpace cardiovascular disorders, cancer, which you actually can't see. I'll have to read this to you because it hasn't scaled right. Sorry about that. Musculoskeletal disorders and endocrine diseases, including diabetes. What's perhaps more striking is when you look at the life course of this, it's not only that these are the most disabling disorders, but they're clearly the most disabling early in life. You'll see this, that before age 50, the disability from mental disorders is actually greater than all other medical disorders combined. That's extraordinary. I mean, we don't usually think about that, but in fact, the big killers, cancer, heart disease, stroke, are disorders of the late stages of life. And when you think about what are the medical problems of people under 50, it's really in this very arena. Now, it's actually beyond just being under 50. When you look and you talk to adults with these disorders, as it says here, 75% report onset before age 25, 50% before age 14. And the numbers are sort of extraordinary. When you look at youth and children, you're talking about almost really 3 times more people, almost, affected with mental disorders than asthma far more than juvenile or type 1 diabetes, and certainly much, much more than cancer. They don't get much attention in this way. We don't think about this as much as a public health problem. They're called sometimes behavioral health, behavioral disorders. The world of people who take care of those with mental illness are usually not medically trained, and they may be actually seen in the criminal justice system. They may be seen among the homeless. They may be seen in a whole range of social service agencies. But even though you've got such an extraordinary public health problem, it's largely outside of healthcare. Just to give you a feeling for the actual different disorders we're talking about, usually when people think about neurodevelopmental, they're thinking autism and ADHD. But what I want to convey to you is that this whole range of illnesses, like schizophrenia or mood disorders or anxiety disorders, are all neurodevelopmental. That is, they're starting at a time when the brain is still developing, and their onset alters the trajectory of brain development. And that's why I think it's so important to think of them within a developmental context. Depression, which we almost always think of as an adult disorder, look at this. I mean, we actually haven't been so aware of this, that the peak time of onset is between ages 13 and 15 or 13 and 18, where you can see the highest bars there. And the numbers are really quite extraordinary, that about 1 in 5 adolescents will have a depressive episode before age 18. Really remarkable numbers that remind us how serious this problem is. Now, what I'd like to share with you today very quickly is the good news that science is taking us in a very different direction in the way we think about these illnesses. And it is not only helping us to think of them as neurodevelopmental, but it's helping us to think of mental disorders as brain disorders, as disorders with a fundamental biology, and it's suggesting ways that technology can make a difference. So I want to take you through each of these opportunities. We'll do them one at a time, but first, just to kind of set the stage for this, look at where we've come in the last decade. This is a slide that I adapted from Francis Collins, changed the numbers a little bit to make them more up to date, but it's kind of an extraordinary story that I don't think the public fully appreciates. The cost and the time to sequence a human genome has plummeted over the last decade, from $22 million per genome to under $2,000 per genome. We're able to now record from hundreds of cells at a time, instead of where we were a decade ago, which was doing at most 16 or sometimes 96 cells in a very special way in vivo. Smartphones now, what 190 million and counting, 2 billion worldwide, really a revolution in what technology might be able to deliver in terms of the purveyance of information. And of course, computing power, following Moore's law, has gone up about 32-fold in that time. Now, the version of Moore's law we like to show is the blue line here, which gives you a sense of how things have changed for the microprocessor industry here in Silicon Valley, and it has, in fact, since 1965, pretty much followed the predictions of Gordon Moore, that you get about a doubling of processing power every 18 to 24 months. But take a look at that red line, which is the reduction in costs for genomic sequencing. I mentioned going from 20 million to 2,000. You can get a sense of that over this very rapid period in the mid-2000s as things began to plummet. And the result was that suddenly we were able to identify genetic associations with many of the psychiatric disorders. It really took off just about the time that genomic sequencing became cheap. And it took off partly because we had put together large repositories of DNA in patients who were very carefully described. We're now up to nearly 1 million samples across 9 disorders, and this is a wonderful international effort involving 32 countries, sharing data, sharing ideas, and sharing results as well, to be able to give us a sense of where the findings are. When you look at those findings, it's really quite surprising that the candidates that all of us had expected for schizophrenia or autism or depression were the ones that were tied to medicines that we had been using. So people were looking at genes associated with serotonin or dopamine. There have now been hundreds of findings, as I showed you in that previous slide, and it seems to tap just about every system you can imagine except for serotonin, and dopamine, which don't seem to show up anywhere in these kind of unbiased approaches to figuring out what might be the underlying risk architecture for these disorders. But the candidates that do come forward are really interesting. They're largely developmental genes. They're genes that are expressed in the brain, specifically usually in the second trimester, sometimes in a big way in the third trimester. They may be genes that aren't expressed in the brain so much in adulthood, but it's very interesting to help us realize when you look at the genomics, you're being pointed towards pathways that are either really important for immune function or pathways important for neurodevelopment. Without taking a lot more time to tell you this, I wanted to just kind of summarize what I think are the kind of key messages that we can now understand about this. The first is that this is a story about risk and not cause, that the genetics of mental illnesses or neurodevelopmental disorders is going to be remarkably complex. It's not what we might have thought a decade ago, where we were looking for a single gene that would explain what causes one person to get schizophrenia and not another. There are so far at least 108, and we're still at the very beginning, genes that have been shown to have variants associated with risk for schizophrenia. The actual number is likely to be hundreds. It will probably be a little bit like height. This is going to be the result of many, many, many genetic variations working together. And what they do is they bias towards a particular set of maybe cognitive features or particular way that people may perceive the world. And then it has a lot to do with the environment, especially the environment during development, that determines how that bias plays out. So this is about risk. It's not about determination or cause. It's very clear that the genomics is teaching us about the importance of timing. As I mentioned, most of the variants that have been of greatest interest are ones that may be expressed in the brain, specifically during development. And that tells us that we have to be thinking about how this plays out over time, that having a developmental perspective, even for understanding genomic impact, is going to be critical. And finally, something that you don't hear much about, but I think we all have to keep in mind, is that there is tremendous heterogeneity in your body for your DNA sequence. It's not just that each of us has slightly different DNA, unless we have an identical twin. It's that even within each of us, cells can have very different DNA sequence, because if cells are replicating, they make lots of mistakes. And they make more mistakes when they replicate quickly, and there's no place where cells replicate more quickly than in the second and early third trimester of development in the human brain. So you can look, as we have done, for DNA variations that are associated with these diseases in blood, but it could be very different in brain. And we have to remember that at the end of the day, even though we have no way of doing this in living tissue, that brain DNA can be quite different than blood DNA. Let's move on to the next revolution, which I think is in neuroscience. This is the era of the Brain Initiative. Lots of excitement about this. And you heard a little bit about this in the previous talk around mapping white matter and what's called the Connectome. The Human Connectome project is this very interesting effort that's been underway for about 6 years now to take a large number of subjects, in this case, I believe there are 1,500 or 1,200 healthy individuals who volunteered to have very, very extensive imaging of their brains. These are people who have had all of these different modalities to look at structure and function and chemistry, even sometimes molecular imaging, along with lots of other tests of their cognition, their personality, genomics, a whole range of things. And all of this has created this wonderful public project called the Human Connectome Project, with all of the data being made public. In fact, it's been made public as they've gone along. So they were released the first 100 and the first 500. They released 900 about 3 months ago, and they'll be releasing the entire data set, which is now complete, in the next few months. It's a fantastic opportunity to look at kind of a reference atlas. In the same way the Human Genome Project gave us that picture of what does the human genome look like, and not only how is it different from a mouse, but how is it different between each of us? What's the kind of normal range of variation? We're doing the same thing here with the Human Connectome Project, getting a sense of both structure and function and how it differs between any two individuals. Fortunately, this movie isn't showing, but the kinds of things that it's already told us is that there are these very interesting relationships between distant areas of the brain, real estate that we had no way of thinking would be connected, that are showing up, particularly with the brain at rest. And so it's given us, in terms of these functional connections, entirely new insights already into how the brain might be organized and how information may be encoded. So it's still early days with this, but a very exciting time. Now, imaging the developing brain is quite a different challenge, but people are now undertaking that challenge in a number of different ways, and I wanted to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about that. The figures on the right, the images are from the top row, neonates, the second row, 1-year-olds, and the third row are 2-year-olds. And it's looking at what's called the default network, which is just the brain at rest. Curious thing about this is that when you look at brain activity with fMRI, the time when you see the most activity is when the brain is, quote, at rest. Unlike any other organ, that's when there's the greatest metabolic activity and the greatest general sense of involved real estate, let's say. And then it goes away when you challenge and give a task, because areas take off and the brain begins to focus in. But you can begin to see that process develop, and that's what the studies are on the right-hand side of this slide. The left is a wonderful image from Rebecca Sachs at MIT, who's been studying this very development, but now in a social context, and how mother-infant interactions can alter the pathways for brain development. The story I wanted to tell you is one that's actually just come out this week, and I think it's a really extraordinary story about how we can now begin to study brain development in young children. It's from Patricia Kuhl's lab at the University of Washington in Seattle. And what Pat's been doing for many, many years is trying to understand language acquisition and the difference between monolingual and bilingual families. And what she's done here is to take 11-month-olds who are not yet speaking and put them into this MEG scanner, magnetic encephalography scanner. You can see that wonderful picture in the upper right hand there of an 11-month-old very happily in this non-invasive, absolutely quiet instrument, which looks like it's something from the 22nd century perhaps. And what they've done then is to play syllables while the baby is in there. MMR, which is what you see in the legend for this figure, it means the mismatch responsivity. So they're playing either English or Spanish syllables, and then when they switch from English to Spanish, they're looking at the brain's response. And what they're showing in a very interesting way is that even at 11 months, kids who have grown up in a bilingual family and have been exposed to both English and Spanish are processing English and Spanish differently, which I find kind of remarkable that they can already do that. But they're also not only identifying the difference in the language, they're identifying both English and Spanish syllables as linguistic, and they're beginning to separate them out and to respond accordingly in a way that doesn't happen for a monolingual family. So what Pat and her team is interested in doing is using brain imaging, in this case with MEG, magnetic encephalography, to begin to look at this process by which language is acquired in the brain, not only behaviorally, but now in terms of neural pathways. It's really an extraordinary opportunity because kids at this point can't tell you what's going on in their heads, but you can begin to get a little bit of glimpse into that black box. Where are we in the case of neuroscience? Well, I would say that there's no question that we have a sense of how the brain develops structurally and functionally. We still have lots of unanswered questions there, but the most remarkable is to realize that this process of brain development goes on well into the 20s. It's one of the reasons why insurance companies don't rent anybody under 25. They realize that the frontal cortex isn't quite there until age 26. We spent a lot of money at NIMH proving that, but we could have simply asked Hertz and we would have found out the answer much more quickly. Increasingly, we've begun to use these tools to identify that there are circuits that are altered in mental illness. And even though we still call it mental illness or behavioral disorders, these are in fact brain illnesses. The difference from neurological illnesses like ALS or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's is we're not talking here about dead cells. We're talking about circuitry. That's sometimes people call these connectopathies. There's a problem in the connections and the functional relationships within the brain. But indeed, the results are no different than if you were to compare having a myocardial infarction, where you've killed off a bunch of heart tissue, to having arrhythmia. These are essentially the arrhythmias of the brain. And with these kinds of tools, we're able to finally see that. And it's been just remarkable to use the tools we have now to understand plasticity and resilience in a way that I think none of us could have imagined. The brain is this extraordinary resilient organ. And in fact, what we've come to learn is that most of the time when you have a brain illness with symptoms, you've had problems for years and years and years. And it's the emergence of symptoms is at the point where the compensation is breaking down. It's not when the problem itself first develops. And that's an important insight, because it tells you that when you see a change with neuroimaging, that might not be the lesion, that might be the opportunity or the attempt of the brain to compensate for that lesion. Let's finish up by saying a little bit about technology, which is, I think, really what Dennis was hoping to hear about. And I'll take you through this in a couple of different ways. I think there's just so much to say here, and it's such an interesting time because it's still really just unfolding for us. It has been phenomenal to realize that in spite of technology revolutionizing entertainment and information and banking and commerce and so many other things in our society, it really hasn't had the impact on healthcare that one might have expected. And why that is, we can talk about. There are many, many reasons, I think. But it doesn't say that that's not to say that it won't have that impact. I think we just haven't really yet found that the sweet spot where this is going to work. I'll give you a few kinds of stories that just remind us of what we can do today very quickly. This is an old story, more than a decade old, about Iris Murdoch, a famous author from the UK, who wrote some 20 or so novels in her lifetime and developed Alzheimer's disease late in her 70s, but continued to write. And her final novel, which was called Jackson's Dilemma, is shown with the triangles there, is the one that she wrote long before she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but at a time when she was already showing manifestations of, well, very subtle manifestations. One wouldn't have picked it up clinically. She probably didn't pick it up personally, but you can see it by analyzing the text of this novel. Really extraordinary. What this shows is that if you map the emergence of new words as you go through the book, going from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40,000 words that have been written, and you identify when new words come up. You can see in her earlier novels, Under the Net and The Sea, there was a continued trajectory that went on even as she got into the much later parts of the book. But that begins to break down in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed some 4 or 5 years later, but I put this up because it tells us that there are really interesting behavioral manifestations or cognitive manifestations that are out there all the time that we don't often take advantage of. Text analysis is fast now, it's cheap, and it's highly accurate, and it allows you to do these kinds of techniques. Is this a diagnostic for early Alzheimer's? Well, not everybody's a novelist, so it probably wouldn't be that useful, but it gives you some sense of the opportunities that could be out there if we think differently. Here's another example of the same sort of thing, and unfortunately, because the animation is off, you can't see this, but search term, I just did this, I think, last weekend. I put in suicide as a cause of death into Google search, and I got this peak in August of 2014, and the quiz question was what happened that week, and as you can see from the answer at the bottom, it was the week that Robin Williams killed himself. There is an enormous amount of information that can be mined out of search. These search trend analyses, any one of us can do it. This is one of the options that are sitting there within Google search. And you can put in your favorite term, your favorite question, and within seconds go through billions of data points to get an answer like this that tells you something about what's happening in society at a given point in time and allows you to follow that. Lots of devices on the market. There's your EKG machine in the upper left, your otoscope in the upper right. On the bottom left is a contact lens that's not yet available, but it's being developed by my company, Verily. It's a contact lens for people with diabetes, and it has a glucose meter embedded in it, a tiny, tiny battery, and a Bluetooth transmitter as well. So if you have diabetes and you wear contacts, this gives you continuous readout of what your glucose is doing, and it sends that to your phone, and your phone in turn can control your insulin pump, and you have already a closed loop, almost like an artificial pancreas. So the kinds of things that can be done here are extraordinary. Google Glass, which Dennis is backstage now, but Dennis has been using as a social prosthetic in kids with autism. Lots of opportunities here to think about how devices could make a difference. Perhaps the most powerful one is the one we all have in our pockets, at least 190 million of us in the United States, and that's the smartphone. What a really interesting opportunity to capture what somebody is doing every day or what they're thinking about, and the opportunity to look at activity and sleep, and to look at how people are typing. When you're depressed, you develop psychomotor retardation, or when you have Parkinson's, the problems with the fine motor skills. Looking at texting as just a reflection of how often someone's reaching out to others, and whether somebody's social network is beginning to contract when they become depressed, whether it expands when they become manic. Voice itself changes enormously as mood and as cognition changes. Lots of opportunities to capture the world around us, to be able to look at facial emotion with video. We're just beginning to think about how this will work and what can be done here. And of course, here, as with everything else we're doing with technology, that the whole key is finding this balance between value and trust. So providing value to people, at the same time you don't creep them out by saying, we've invaded your privacy in a way that'll make you really uncomfortable. People who are struggling with a bad illness that's often fatal, like depression, and if they've made a suicide attempt, often will say, I need help. And this is one way to give me some reflection of how my behavior is changing, because you know what? I'm not so good at picking that up often. There's lots of things besides these kinds of devices. We've got wearables. We've got wonderful registries that are now getting people to share their experience and to put this experience into the public domain. So their privacy is less of an issue for them than the reward of being able to hear from other people who have the same issues and who can share their experience. So patients like me, a great example of that. 23andMe doing some amazing science now on the 1.2 million people who have shared their DNA and who have also been talking about the kinds of things that they're concerned about. So I think in this case, I think it's fair to say we can finally begin to look at behavior very objectively, maybe continuously, passively, and with enormous accuracy. That's incredibly exciting. We can begin to now measure behavior the way we measure blood glucose. I think that mental health is really a great place to be thinking about this, because unlike in diabetes and heart disease, we can have both the afferent loop and the efferent loop can all live on your phone. So both the diagnostics, like getting this digital phenotype, as well as the intervention itself can be there when you can push out cognitive behavior therapy or peer support or coaching on the same device that you're using to understand when someone's depressed. But I am still a bit of a skeptic. I think we still need to get the data to know that this is working. So let me summarize what I've told you. First point is that mental disorders are neurodevelopmental disorders, and they cause the greatest morbidity and mortality for people under 50 and certainly for people under 40 or 30. We've got fantastic traction. I gave you examples of that in genomics, imaging, and technology. But I want to highlight this because I don't think that even those areas of scientific breakthrough and scientific revolution are going to bend the curve for us in terms of morbidity and mortality unless we can change several things about practice: the diagnostic system, the way that we develop therapeutics and the therapeutics we offer, and research itself, which needs to change so that it engages people more broadly, and we think not so much about moving research into practice, but increasingly moving practice into research. It's a big challenge. I often end by citing Bill Gates, who has a thought about these kinds of things when he says we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. And I think that's probably true in healthcare when we think about the role of technology. There is a lot of hype, and there's a lot going on, and we're all very excited about what will happen. But I think most likely the biggest changes are going to play out over a decade and not by 2017, 2018. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your interest, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
That's great. Outstanding. Thank you, Tom. Do we have any questions from the audience? Can't see very well.
Here's one. Yeah. Yeah, what a great question. The difference between developmental disorders and neurodegenerative or aging disorders. That, I think in general, both of them, I would say, share the fact that they involve the brain, and by that, whatever symptoms you see are probably late events of what's happening in the brain. But probably the most salient part of this is that with neurodegeneration, you're losing cells, or you're losing connections. We don't know what's happening with neurodevelopment. Many people think it's actually the opposite problem, that you're producing too many and you're not losing enough because there's a pruning process that takes place across adolescence. That's possible, but it's probably much more refined than that. I think in the case of depression, PTSD, schizophrenia, eating disorders, OCD, these are all not brain-wide, the way that dementia is kind of all across the cortex. It involves very specific circuits and changes in those circuits, which are probably not due to the dropout of cells or even the dropout of connections, but just changes in the connections between parts of the circuit. So think arrhythmia as opposed to lesion. Oh, I love this question. So is it time to change the name mental disease to something else? Yes, it's way past time. I used to be the director of an institute called the National Institute of Mental Health. And I was always kind of amazed by this, because people would say, we had the National Cancer Institute, we had the National Institute of Infectious Diseases and National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Stroke. But when it came to this area, it was as if nobody even wanted to call these illnesses. They had to just say, well, it's mental health, which kind of trivializes these very deadly problems. It takes an act of Congress to change the name of an NIH institute, so I didn't actually take that on, but I hope somebody does, because I think our language traps us here. These are brain disorders, and we ought to be honest about this. These are neurodevelopmental disorders, and we should recognize that that has important implications for how you diagnose, how you treat, how you fund, and most of all, the public policy around what we expect here. So we don't, for instance, set the standards here for care that we have for cancer and heart disease. There's simply no way, I don't think, that you would have 400,000 people in the workforce for cancer, but only have maybe 8 or 10% of them that had ever had training in an evidence-based treatment, and only about 20% who had any medical training. So there's the fact that we can't call these illnesses has really trapped us into being able to provide high standards of care, health care, for the people with them. And we have to change that. That's going to be one of the first things. Language matters. Words matter.
I think we're going to have to move on, unfortunately.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom.